Ethan Marshall pressed his knees into the cold concrete of his garage floor. Before him lay a tangled mess of copper wiring and oxidized metal. It was his first attempt at automation, a project that had managed to travel exactly 3 inches across the floor before the drive system seized and collapsed. He reached into the wreckage, picking up a single bent gear. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the resistance in the teeth. He did not toss it into the scrap bin. He stood up, walked to his workbench, and pulled his notebook into the light. He sketched the exact point of the gear failure, noting the stress marks in the metal. This was the only rhythm he knew: build, crash, analyze, repeat. While others spent their weekends at parties, Ethan spent his under the harsh glare of a soldering iron. He spent hours stripping wires and refining circuits until they were lean and efficient. There was no frustration in the silence of the room, only the sound of his own steady breathing. He wiped grease from his fingers, picked up a fresh component, and started again. The garage lights faded into the hum of fluorescent tubes. Years later, Ethan sat in a gray cubicle, the air stale with recycled oxygen. He watched the lines of code scroll across his monitor, refining automation systems for a global manufacturer. Across the row, brilliant engineers tapped away at their keyboards, solving problems that would generate millions in revenue for the firm. Ethan tracked the hours on his watch. He watched the managers walk the floor, collecting the results of months of labor. He realized the math of his life had shifted. He was trading his specialized knowledge for a fixed, stagnant salary, while the company owners captured the true value of every circuit he perfected. He pushed his chair back and stared at the beige partition. There was a constant, low-frequency vibration from the ventilation system that mirrored the inefficiency of his position. He opened a spreadsheet, saw the profit margins, and felt the weight of his own potential sitting idle. He was a component in someone else's machine, and for the first time, he stopped trying to optimize their software and started looking for the exit. Ethan kept a small, leather-bound book tucked beneath his keyboard. During his lunch break, he opened it to a marked page. The words stood out against the thin paper. Knowledge is only potential. It becomes wealth when organized and directed. He read the sentence 3 times, tracing the ink with his thumb. He looked up at the row of cubicles. The realization hit him with the weight of a physical object. He had been organizing his knowledge for his employer, but he had never directed it for himself. That evening, he stayed behind long after the office lights dimmed to security-level minimums. He did not open the company's software. Instead, he pulled a stack of napkins from the break room and a mechanical pencil from his pocket. He began to draw. He sketched a chassis, then a drivetrain, then a power distribution system. He erased lines that were too heavy and redrew them with sharper angles. The napkin surface was thin, but he pressed hard, leaving indentations that would remain long after the graphite faded. He was no longer working for a salary. He was designing a future. Every line he drew was a piece of knowledge being organized into a new, singular purpose. Ethan spent his weekends driving through the industrial outskirts. He walked into small machine shops and family-run factories where the air was thick with metal shavings and the smell of grease. He watched men and women manually feed parts into presses, repeating the same motion for 10 hours a day. He checked the price tags on the automated arms displayed in industry catalogs and compared them to the handwritten ledgers of these small business owners. The numbers were unreachable. These factories were being priced out of the future. He returned to his desk. The image of those manual, repetitive tasks burned into his mind. The problem was not that the technology didn't exist. It was that the technology was too heavy, too expensive, and too rigid for a shop that only needed to move 5 pounds of product at a time. He began to strip down his designs. He removed the excess metal, the unnecessary sensors, and the complex software layers that bloated production costs. He focused on modularity. If he could build a unit from standard off-the-shelf components, he could drop the price by 80%. He drew a new schematic, one that looked less like a corporate machine and more like a tool. He was no longer building for his former employers. He was building for the people who had been left behind. The garage became a graveyard of failed ambition. Ethan built the first version with lightweight aluminum, but the motors stalled instantly, the chassis bowing under the pressure of a 5-pound steel block. He stripped it down, reinforced the joints, and tried again. The second iteration groaned, lurched forward 2 inches, and then a drive belt snapped with a sharp crack that echoed against the concrete walls. He spent the next 48 hours without sleep, resoldering connections and calibrating the torque sensors. The third version was his most refined attempt yet. He placed the weight, engaged the power, and watched as the arm vibrated violently before collapsing into a tangled heap of metal and plastic. Silence filled the room. Ethan stared at the wreckage. His palms were raw. His eyes burned from the harsh overhead light, and the pile of scrap mocked his certainty. He took a breath, reached for a different gear ratio, and adjusted the tension of the primary arm. He reset the machine. He placed the 5-pound weight back on the cradle. He flipped the switch. The motor hummed a steady rhythmic sound, and the arm lifted. It did not shake. It did not stall. It moved the package from one side of the table to the other with mechanical precision. He stood frozen, watching the machine repeat the cycle, the tension in his chest finally breaking. Ethan loaded the prototype into the back of his car and drove to the oldest machine shop in the district. He hauled the machine onto a workbench in front of the owner, a man whose hands were mapped with permanent grease stains. The owner looked at the modular frame, then at Ethan, and laughed. He called it a toy. He said it would fall apart before the lunch whistle blew. Ethan did not argue. He plugged the unit into a wall outlet and set it to a repetitive task, sorting brass fittings into bins. The machine began to work. It moved with relentless, boring consistency. 10 minutes passed, then 30. The owner stopped talking. He walked around the machine, watching the arm pivot and retract, never missing a beat, never slowing down. The skepticism in the room evaporated, replaced by the sound of the motor and the clatter of brass. The owner watched for an hour, his arms crossed, his eyes narrow. He finally reached into his back pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and slapped it onto the workbench. Ethan delivered the unit the next morning. He drove back home, walked into his office, and opened his laptop. He typed his resignation letter. He hit send. The cubicle life was over. The warehouse was waiting. The warehouse was a cavern of echoes. 3 weeks in, the reality of the business hit harder than any engineering problem. A primary supplier went silent, leaving his assembly lines empty. Ethan stood in the center of the floor, staring at a stack of incomplete units. Then, the code failed. A critical bug in the sorting software caused the mechanical arms to lock mid-cycle, slamming into each other with a sickening screech of metal. He was chasing ghosts. He spent 72 hours in the warehouse, sleeping on a cot between the rows of dead machines. Every hour brought a new crisis. A motor failed. A circuit board fried. The budget was bleeding out as he scrambled to source parts from secondary vendors. He pulled the housing off the primary controller, his fingers moving over the wiring in a desperate rhythm. The air was cold, smelling of ozone and hydraulic fluid. He was not just building robots anymore. He was fighting the clock to keep the doors open. Every minute the machine stayed dark, his reputation took a hit. He wiped the grease from his forehead, reset the system, and initiated a hard reboot. The system flickered. The code held. But the next order was already overdue, and the supply chain remained a tangled mess of broken promises. The turning point came when the primary supplier raised prices again. Ethan reached for his soldering iron, then stopped. Fixing the hardware would not fix the contract. He sat down, opened a stack of legal documents, and spent the night learning the language of leverage. He called the supplier at dawn, outlined a tiered payment structure, and locked in a lower rate. The cycle of panic broke. He turned his attention to the clients. A shop foreman complained that the software interface was too dense, too technical. Ethan did not defend his code. He spent a week studying user experience design, stripping away the complex menus, until the machine could be operated with one hand. He stopped selling hardware. He started selling time. He realized his value was not in the gears, but in the hours he gave back to the factory owners. He expanded his team, training a fleet of technicians to handle the installations and maintenance. The warehouse began to hum with the sound of a living business. He was no longer just the person who built the machines. He was the person who ensured they never stopped working. Each unit delivered was a contract fulfilled, a system optimized, and a profit margin secured. He had traded his solitary workbench for a network of operations. 5 years of relentless work condensed into a single digital document. Ethan sat in his private office, the glow of the monitor illuminating the lines of the balance sheet. He scrolled down, his cursor hovering over the final entry. The number crossed the 7-figure threshold. He stopped. The office was quiet, a stark contrast to the roar of the factory floor he had left behind. He closed the file, the screen turning dark. His gaze drifted to the corner of his desk. There, resting on a small stand, sat the heap of rusted metal and tangled wires that had been his first machine. It had traveled 3 inches before collapsing. He reached out and touched the bent frame, the metal cold and unyielding under his fingertips. He remembered the long nights on the garage floor, the smell of burning solder, and the frustration of every failed iteration. He had not built a fortune because he was the smartest person in the room. He had built it because he refused to let his curiosity sit idle. He had taken his initial failure, sharpened it with years of discipline, and turned it into a solution that others were willing to pay for. He pulled his hand back, stood up, and left the office behind. Ethan pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped onto the factory floor. The air vibrated with the steady, rhythmic hum of production. He walked past the rows of workstations, his eyes tracking the movement of the robotic arms. They moved in perfect, calculated synchronization, lifting, placing, and securing components without a single hesitation. Each motion was a physical echo of the sketches he had once drawn on napkins in the dead of night. He stopped at the end of the line and watched a completed unit slide off the assembly belt. It was not just hardware. It was the material proof of 1,000 failed attempts and years of disciplined correction. He realized then that the balance sheet in his office was merely a byproduct. The real wealth was not the number sitting on that screen. The wealth was the process itself, the ability to take a fragile, impossible idea and force it into the physical world until it worked. He stood still in the center of the noise, listening to the machines accelerate the pace of his clients' businesses. He had turned his curiosity into a functioning engine, and that was the only outcome that mattered. He turned away from the line, walked toward the exit, and left the humming factory behind him.